Alright, so my opinion on this movie is worth about as much as a breakdancing lesson from an Australian Olympian, but I asked if you all wanted this or a Cuckoo review and you voted for this, despite me lacking the context of most of the franchise. Full disclosure, I've only seen the first Alien, and I saw it for the first time like 2 or 3 months ago, like whenever they released it in the theater for the 45th anniversary. That was when I saw it for the first time. Sci-fi wasn't really something I grew up with, and I've never been drawn to it all that much. It can be a hard sell for me, and I feel like I never really fully settle into futuristic stories or resonate with them the way I do period films or fantasy stuff, so I just never sat myself down to go through these movies. That being said, I did really enjoy seeing Alien, and I was actually kind of glad that I waited because I got to watch it in a theater full of people who were super excited to be there, which felt like a very fitting way to see it for the first time. Point of all this is that I'm missing a lot of franchise context, and I'm sure there are tons of things in this movie that went over my head or didn't hit as hard because I didn't have that connective tissue in my arsenal. There could be things I saw and went, wow, what a cool idea, but it was actually ripped straight from one of the other movies. I don't know about any of that, but what I do know is that this movie fucks, and it fucks hard. Just like a breakdancing lesson from an Australian Olympian, there's still some value in me sharing my uninformed perspective here, so let's talk about this thing. I was fairly confident that this was going to be a solid movie since Fede Alvarez did that Evil Dead movie that I absolutely adore with all of my heart, but I was honestly shocked by just how much I liked Romulus as someone who's only seen one of these. The big thing that I really didn't want to see was just a retread of the original movie with some amplified elements, and I was relieved that it wasn't any more than 10 minutes into the movie that I realized this thing actually did have a story to tell with its own identity, and not only that, but I was immediately drawn in by what was presented in that story. It's also got this really great old school vibe from the opening credits that felt very genuine, and it's easy to tell that Alvarez has a lot of love for that original movie. First impressions were solid and promising, and it only got better and better as it went on, with some of the stuff in the back half of this movie being so insanely cool and tension-filled in a way that felt like it was taking full advantage of everything available to a horror movie taking place on an abandoned spacecraft filled with insectile aliens. The setting isn't just a background piece for your standard horror movie, it's utilized in such creative and suspenseful ways, which really helps me in getting sucked into the world, which is always my biggest roadblock when it comes to futuristic or sci-fi movies.
My nerd shit is better than your nerd shit, you lame bitch. Fantasy for life.
For the most part, I didn't have any issues following anything that was going on in the story, save for one or two little things where I felt like I was missing some information from the other movies that would have tied things together a bit. But I've convened with some more educated parties and have been informed that there are things I didn't even realize were direct tie-ins with other entries that I still didn't have a hard time piecing together because the movie did a good enough job at making it clear what was going on for me to not feel like I was being left in the dark. There were some reveals and twists at the end that were still very cool to me, but I can imagine would have been a hell of a lot more impactful if I had the context. Point is, if you're like me and picked the wrong breakdancing teacher, you can still go into this movie and have a damn good time without feeling completely lost on what's going on. It's a really great blend of this self-contained franchise continuation with something that, from what I've gathered, has some significant lore implications for the franchise that are apparently very cool, but I can't speak to those till I've seen the rest. Having a good cast of characters when you're dealing with a really tight and isolated setting like this is important, and there's a solid group here to follow along with, although nothing that's going to be a huge standout, save for David Johnson in the role of Andy, who gives a really interesting and varied performance, but this is a nice, eclectic cast of characters that all provided great turns for the story to take without blending together, and the performances from the cast all around were very good and at times pretty damn harrowing or emotional. I do think there could have been a bit more with showing some different angles of certain characters to give more emotional weight to some of their individual stories, but I also did really appreciate that there aren't like massive exposition dumps on any of them. We don't learn tons about these people, but the things we do learn are quite relevant to how they act throughout the story and are all delivered very naturally, which makes me happy. I just think like one or two little scenes could have added quite a bit to a couple of these people. One of my favorite things about Alien Romulus is that it never feels like it's comfortable establishing an approach to the horror and then settling into it for the rest of the movie. There are constantly new threats or new situations for those threats to be in that kept the tension crazy high and the predictability low, which in turn also made the pacing really nice because there were always fresh angles being taken. I was slightly weary going in of the runtime because a 2-hour movie with an isolated group of characters like this can be pretty demanding on the script, but there's so much variety in the set pieces and story progression that it never became an issue. The movie chugs along very steadily from the get-go, and there's no meandering before getting things moving and trapping us in an abandoned spacecraft. A lot of the praises I'm throwing this movie's way are very reminiscent of my feelings about Alvarez's Evil Dead entry, which I think just goes to show how competent he is as a horror filmmaker and how much he understands what makes a certain franchise click with its fans while also delivering something unique that offers a vision worth hearing out. I was wondering if this was going to be like crazy gory like that movie was, but and you know, while there are certainly some moments that got under my skin, it's done in quite a reserved way for the most part, which keeps the suspense intact and makes it so that the movie is never relying on gore to keep you engaged. This is all about getting on board with these characters and feeling like you're trapped in this isolated place with them, and then steadily ramping up the tension and intensity as they try and find a way to get off this godforsaken thing. I was just completely hooked by this movie the whole way through, and it kept going and ramping things up and introducing new situations that provided some great new context to a pre-established threat that kept me engaged through what could have very easily been a bloated runtime, but is actually anything but that. Despite being unfamiliar with the franchise, I was very satisfied by the narrative and how it continued things from that first movie, and now I'm looking forward to going through the rest of them and seeing how some of the story implications in this movie change the way I see some of those earlier entries. Maybe not the ideal way to go through the franchise, but it's an angle I'm interested in nonetheless. I have heard some of the reveals toward the end are divisive, so maybe if you're a hardcore fan of the franchise's lore as it is, you may be frustrated by what happens. I have no clue, but this is just such a well-crafted and suspenseful sci-fi horror movie that really took me by surprise and made me interested to finally rectify this blind spot in my horror compendium. Yeah, maybe I'll have to go through and make dedicated videos about these movies at some point. It's not going to be anytime soon, unfortunately. The schedule is packed up as it is. So yeah, not sure how much stock anyone's actually going to put into my thoughts on this one, given my lack of knowledge about the franchise, but I seem to be pretty in line with the consensus that this thing is awesome, and I could at least serve as confirmation that it definitely can stand on its own and be a damn good time, proving once again how good Fede Alvarez is at these franchise continuations. I had a great time, and it makes me super glad to see this movie succeed in the way it is. I will get around to covering the franchise more eventually, but until then, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.